Backrooms is a film that is difficult to explain because it is not built like a traditional mystery. It does not give us a series of clues leading to a single, reasonable answer. Nor does it work as a horror story where it is enough to identify the monster, understand its rules, and survive until the end. Kane Parsons' film works with a different kind of fear. The fear of entering a place that should not exist, and that cannot be explained. What is strange about Backrooms is that it does not feel entirely like hell, nor like a fantastical dimension or a haunted place. It looks more like an abandoned office, an old store, a hotel corridor, a waiting room, or a simple furniture showroom. Places we recognize as designed for people, but where the human presence seems to have been erased. The film takes that internet-born myth and turns it into a story about memory, trauma, and failure. Clark enters the Backrooms believing he found a revelation. Mary enters trying to rescue him. But what both discover is that this place does not only contain infinite rooms, it also contains distorted versions of those who enter it. In the end, Clark is devoured by a monstrous copy of himself. Mary seems to escape, but ends up captured, and in the final image, another Mary, deformed, remains trapped inside the labyrinth. This A24 film leaves many questions and very few answers, but that is no reason to stop trying to answer them. Where does the Backrooms myth come from, and what exactly is it? The Backrooms myth is born from an image. It all began in 2019 when an anonymous user posted a photo on 4chan. A yellow room, empty, poorly lit, with old carpet and identical walls. Just that. From there, a disturbing feeling was born, a sensation that this space was real, but contained something that was wrong, as if it were a memory that one cannot quite place. From that image came the central idea of the myth. If you accidentally no-clip out of reality, you can end up in the Backrooms. No-clip is a video game term. It describes the moment when a character passes through a wall, goes out of bounds, or falls into an area the player should not see. In a game, no-clipping reveals the trick behind what keeps the game running, that is, the safe zone. Behind the wall, there is no world, only emptiness, incomplete textures, or unfinished spaces, things that are there by mistake, filler, and so on. Backrooms transforms that idea into cosmic horror. What would happen if reality also had incomplete zones? What would happen if someone could fall out of the world? According to Kane Parsons, that idea of accidentally crossing the boundaries of the real is fundamental. For him, it is not about entering a hell or being punished. It is about a failure, an anomaly, a surface error. That is why the Backrooms do not work like a haunted house, for example. A haunted house usually has a history. Someone died there, something was cursed, a spirit became trapped. These spaces are more terrifying because they do not seem to have moral intent. They simply exist. And if you enter, the place begins to absorb you because that is the new reality. It is also important to understand the idea of liminal spaces. A liminal space is a place of transit. Hallways, hotels, offices, shopping malls, airports, staircases, basements, parking lots. They are places designed to be passed through, not to be lived in. Under normal conditions, they do not unsettle us, because they are filled with people, noise, function, and movement. But when they appear empty, frozen, and silent, something changes. The Backrooms are infinite liminal spaces. They have no purpose, no destination. Everything seems built for an activity that no longer takes place. It is therefore a version that inhabits a familiar but unused space. What can be born from that? What is a chair if no one uses it, if no one has seen it? What is the nature of something that is not used? The only word that can describe that is deformity. And that is what one finds in these spaces. Who is Kane Parsons? Kane Parsons, also known as Kane Pixels, is the YouTuber who turned the Backrooms legend into a modern audio-visual narrative. He did not invent the original image or the internet concept, but he was the one who gave it the greatest recognition. In 2022, he began publishing a series of analog horror videos with a found footage aesthetic that studied the phenomenon. The important thing is that he understood something essential about the myth. The Backrooms do not need a visible creature to be frightening. Strange things can appear, but the space itself is the monster. A camera walking through empty hallways, the hum of the lights, the repeated rooms, the impossible angles, and the feeling that something might appear behind a wall are enough to build tension. In his videos, Parsons was already working with the idea that the Backrooms could be studied as a physical phenomenon. That is where Async appears, an institution that does not treat the place as an urban legend, but as a scientific discovery. That shift is important because it takes the myth out of purely paranormal territory. The Backrooms are not just a weird dimension. They are something that an institution can measure, map, exploit, conceal, and perhaps turn into technology. The film takes all of that and makes it more intimate by using characters from the real world. It begins with Clark, an ordinary man, emotionally deteriorated, who finds a door in the basement of his store. That decision causes the myth to stop being just a visual idea and become a possibility. According to Kane Parsons, he is not interested in drowning the viewer in lore. That statement is key to understanding the film, because he does not want Backrooms to function as an encyclopedia of levels, creatures, and rules. He wants it to function as an experience where the viewer feels they understand enough to be afraid, but not enough to master the mystery. What is the film about? The film follows Clark, a man who runs a furniture store called Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire. One day, he discovers a small opening in the basement of the store. That entrance leads to the Backrooms, a labyrinth of yellowish rooms, fluorescent lights, damp carpets, illogical hallways, and absurdly placed objects. In a typical horror story, Clark would flee, but he does not. He returns, eager to exploit the discovery and prove that what he saw is real. Clark involves his employees Kat and Bobby, and later Mary, his therapist, enters when she tries to find him. From that point on, the film reveals that the Backrooms are not empty. There are entities that appear to be deformed human copies. There is a monster that seems to pursue the characters. And there is an institution, Async, that has been studying the phenomenon for some time. Who is Clark, and why is he the protagonist? Clark is a frustrated man because his life has not turned out the way he wanted. He wanted to be an architect in order to create spaces with meaning, but ended up as the owner of a not very successful furniture store. He dreamed of having a family, but his wife ends up leaving him. He imagined himself becoming a self-made man, but ended up as a drunk who has to live in the same place where he works. He is the protagonist because he is the character who most needs to lie to himself. He is someone who turned his failure into resentment. His public persona is a ridiculous pirate character that makes him feel humiliated every time he sees himself on television. He has a therapist, but instead of looking at all of that honestly, he wants someone to validate his misery. Clark needs to construct a narrative where he is the main victim in order to seek absolution or some meaning for his suffering. He needs someone to tell him that he was not responsible, that his ex-wife destroyed him, that the world unfairly reduced him to a furniture salesman, and that his anger is justified. The Backrooms appear in his life at the perfect moment, because they offer him exactly that, a way to escape without changing. In the real world, Clark is forced to face consequences. In the Backrooms, he can rewrite his identity. Clark does not see this space as a threat, but as a possibility that finally has a psychological effect on him. All his worries rest there. He feels good there. In the real world, he is a failed man. In the Backrooms, he can be a discoverer, an explorer, the keeper of a secret. That is why he is the protagonist. Not because he is heroic, but because his weakness connects directly to how the place works. The Backrooms, however, seem to copy, distort, and reflect whatever they absorb, and Clark is full of distortable material. Denied guilt, rage, humiliation, failure, fantasies of control, and a need for validation. Clark's tragedy is that he finds a place that seems to understand him, but in reality only repeats him. The Backrooms do not heal him. According to Kane Parsons, Clark is in a kind of echo chamber. That idea is crucial. The Backrooms do not contradict Clark, they amplify him. They return a deformed version of his inner world to him. And because Clark desperately wants to feel validated, he mistakes that amplification for peace. Who is Mary? What is her past? And why is the rock so important to her? Mary is Clark's therapist, but she is not in the story merely to explain the protagonist's mind. Mary is also a survivor. Her past is marked by confinement, her mother's mental illness, and a childhood where home became a prison. That detail is essential because it connects Mary to the Backrooms before she physically enters them. Mary already knows the experience of being trapped in a closed place by a logic she does not control. Her childhood was her first labyrinth. The rock, or more precisely the fragment of cement, is important because it contains an imprint of that past, a mark from a childhood that Mary cannot erase. The house can be demolished, time can pass, Mary can become a therapist and build an adult life, but the imprint remains. That cement is trauma turned into object. Here lies the most important contrast between Mary and Clark. Clark also has wounds, but he turns them into resentment. Mary has wounds, but she looks at them with more awareness, and although she cannot move past some things, she seems to have no friends or relationships, she tries to move forward in other ways. When Mary uses that fragment of cement to defend herself against Pirate Clark, the film shows how she can use her memory to fight against a greater evil. Clark enters the Backrooms and lets the place transform his pain into a monster. Mary enters and uses a remnant of her pain as a tool to stay alive. The rock symbolizes a relationship with the past. For Clark, the past is an excuse. For Mary, the past is a wound, but also proof, memory, and resistance. What is Async? Async is the institution that studies the Backrooms. In the film, it appears as an organization with scientists, protective equipment, cameras, protocols, interrogation rooms, and the capacity to capture entities. But Async should not be interpreted as an omnipotent organization. It does not seem to control the phenomenon. Async represents the film's second type of horror. The first is the horror of space, getting lost in an impossible labyrinth. The second is institutional horror, being found by an organization that decides your experience no longer belongs to you. Phil, the investigator who interrogates her, is not presented as a cartoonish villain. That makes him more unsettling. He seems reasonable. He seems tired. He even seems aware that he does not understand everything. But he is part of a structure that can detain Mary, conceal information, and experiment with the unknown. When Mary escapes from Pirate Clark, the viewer expects relief. But there is no relief. She is captured by Async. She goes from being the victim of a monster to being an object of study. The danger changes shape. No longer yellow hallways and deformed creatures, now it is laboratories, questions, protocols, scientists, and locked doors. Async represents modern arrogance in the face of mystery. If something exists, it must be measured. If it can be measured, it must be contained. If it can be contained, it must be exploited. The problem is that the Backrooms do not seem like a phenomenon made to be possessed. Async believes it is studying an anomaly, but perhaps the anomaly is also studying Async. Why is the Backrooms entrance in Clark's store? Are there other entrances? The entrance is in Clark's store because that store is already, symbolically, an antechamber to the Backrooms. A furniture store is a strange place if you think about it. It is filled with rooms that look like homes but are not. It has sofas, tables, beds, lamps, and dining sets. Everything imitates domestic intimacy, but without real life. No one actually sleeps in those beds, or actually dines at those tables, much less inhabits those spaces. They are home stagings. The Backrooms also look like human spaces without humanity. They imitate offices, stores, living rooms, and hallways, but contain no coherent life. They copy the form of the human world, but not its function. That is why the door does not appear just anywhere. It appears in a furniture store because Clark's store is already an artificial copy of life. And the Backrooms are the infinite, defective copy of that artificiality. The location also reveals something about Clark. He wanted to be an architect, someone who designed spaces with intention, proportion, and meaning. But he ended up confined to a cheap commercial space, surrounded by simulations of homes. Then he finds an impossible and infinite architecture. It is as if the universe were offering him a monstrous version of his frustrated desire. Clark could not build the world he wanted, so he becomes obsessed with a world that nobody built. Are there other entrances? The film suggests there are. Async knows too much for Clark's case to be the first. It is also mentioned that the organization has been studying the phenomenon for some time, and that other entry points or faults exist. This changes everything. If the store were the only entrance, the story would be a local curiosity. But if there are multiple entrances, then the Backrooms are a disease of reality, a fault that can open anywhere. That makes the terror much greater. The question is no longer what is beneath Clark's store. The question becomes, how many walls in the world are actually walls? Are the Backrooms a purgatory, an anomaly, or a simulation? The film allows for several symbolic readings, but one thing is worth making clear. The Backrooms are not simply a hallucination. According to Kane Parsons, the Backrooms are not a hell or a purgatory. They do not operate by moral logic. No one ends up there because they deserve it, or falls there because their soul has a debt. Nor is it a digital simulation in a literal sense. The video game reference comes from the idea of being trapped outside the map, but that does not mean the place is virtual. The best definition is that the Backrooms are a physical anomaly, a fracture in reality, a tangible, real, impersonal space that exists beyond everyday logic. But what is interesting is that although they are physical, they behave like damaged memory. They copy rooms, objects, sounds, people, and memories, but reconstruct them defectively. That is why it is not enough to say it is another dimension. It is a dimension that seems to feed on fragments of the human world. All of this could be defined as a kind of corrupted archive of reality. Not necessarily a conscious archive, but something that records poorly, as if everything that exists left an impression, a trace, a residue, and the Backrooms were the place where those erroneous traces become mixed. Moreover, these must be contaminable spaces. They are not born from Clark's or Mary's mind, but they can be altered by what Clark and Mary carry within them. That is why the place is so frightening. It has no morality, but it can reflect trauma and insecurity. What are the still lifes? The still lifes are failed human copies. They look like people, but they are not complete. They have human form, but something in them is empty, incorrect, or poorly assembled. They are like memories of people made by something that never understood what a person is. The name still life is very important. In art, a still life is a nature morte, a composition of motionless objects. The still lifes are motionless lives, people reduced to composition. Within the film, Clark explains that the Backrooms remember things from the real world, but do not remember them well. That idea helps us understand the still lifes. They are not classic zombies or possessed humans. They are reproduction errors, as if the place had seen a face, a body, a posture, or an emotion, but could not reconstruct the interior. There lies an interesting idea about this world. The still lifes reveal the limit of the Backrooms. The place can copy what is visible, but it cannot copy the soul, the consciousness, or the experience. They do not frighten us because they are completely different from us. They frighten us because they are too close, an imitation without understanding. Who is Pirate Clark, and why does he kill Clark? Pirate Clark is the central creature of the finale. He is a physical entity of the Backrooms, not a still life. A deformed version of the pirate character Clark used to promote his store. Symbolically, he is the worst version of Clark made flesh. Not the architect or the husband. He is his humiliated self. The cheap pirate from the commercials. The character that turns his business into a joke. What is interesting is that, although morality does not exist within this space, the Backrooms still do not give Clark the version of himself he wants. They return to him the version that most shames him, but turned into a monster. Arriving at the final scene, following an intense argument between Clark and Mary, Clark believes he has made peace with his life. That is when Pirate Clark appears. As already explained, what Clark calls peace is actually surrender, because he's embracing a fantasy that allows him not to change. According to Kane Parsons, that scene is the engine of the film, and it makes sense. Clark's entire arc leads to that gesture. A man who wants to be validated embraces the monstrous version of his self-deception. The result is that version devours him. Pirate Clark kills Clark because Clark surrenders to him. Not because the creature is the universe's punishment, but because the monster represents a logic the protagonist has already accepted. Clark decided to live in a lie, and it ultimately consumes him. The scene dismantles the fantasy of toxic self-acceptance. Things are not fixed by accepting oneself as a form of self-justification. Clark embraces his destructive side, thinking it means freedom. But what he actually does is accept being a monster without reservation. In other words, destruction only knows more destruction. Pirate Clark does what he does to Clark because Clark has already accepted a life where he only accepts destruction, and therefore, the only ending for the protagonist is a destructive one. Why does Mary manage to survive? Mary survives because, unlike Clark, she does not confuse trauma with total identity. When Clark ties her to the chair, he tries to force her to participate in his theater. He wants her to repeat the therapeutic conversation, to validate him, to take on the role he needs. Even when he forces her to resemble his ex-wife, he is trying to reduce her to a figure within his personal drama. Clark does not see Mary as a person. He sees her as an instrument of absolution. But Mary refuses. She tells him the truth. She does not enter his game. That refusal breaks the fantasy. During the chase, Mary uses the cement fragment from her childhood to defend herself. That detail is the symbolic center of her survival. The same memory that could paralyze her becomes a weapon. The trauma does not disappear, but its function changes. It is no longer only a prison. It can also be a tool. Mary survives because she does not try to erase her past or live inside it. Clark does the opposite. Clark wants to remain in a space that allows him to freeze his pain and turn it into a world. Mary, on the other hand, keeps moving. Even wounded, even terrified, she does not settle into the wound. That is why she escapes from Pirate Clark. Not because she has definitively defeated the Backrooms, but because she did not allow herself to be absorbed by the same logic that destroyed Clark. Is the Mary being interrogated by Async the real Mary or a copy? This is one of the great questions of the ending, and the film does not answer it definitively. Several theories are possible. The first is that the Mary being interrogated is the real one, and that she was able to leave the Backrooms, whether rescued or abducted by Async. What comes next is unknown. The copy of Mary we see at the end is only a remnant of that situation because she was partially absorbed like a still life. The second theory is that the Mary being interrogated could be a copy. Perhaps the real Mary never got out. Perhaps the entity Async is interrogating believes itself to be Mary, has her memories, or part of them, but is not the original. This theory fits the logic of the place. If the Backrooms can copy people, how do we know that a copy knows it is a copy? Perhaps Async knows how to communicate with the still lifes. That would explain that ending. The third theory is the most far-fetched, but not impossible. Perhaps Mary is the one interrogating the copy of Mary. Phil is the one speaking, but behind the glass stands Mary. She managed to physically escape the Backrooms, but the place had already registered her. That is why we see a deformed version of Mary inside the labyrinth. Mary is alive, but she has already left part of herself behind. The final copy of Mary tells us that the Backrooms remembers her. And in this film, being remembered by that place is a form of condemnation. What do the seagulls and the cardboard man mean? The seagulls and the cardboard man are two strange elements because they do not seem to follow the logic of the space, but they help us understand how both the Backrooms and Async operate. A seagull belongs to the outside, the sky, the sea, the open air, movement. Its presence, or its sound, inside the Backrooms creates a contradiction. It is a symbol of freedom, trapped in a place without freedom. A fragment of the open world absorbed by an enclosed space. The seagulls function as proof that the Backrooms do not only copy solid objects, they also copy atmospheres, sounds, associations, and sensory memories. It should be remembered that the store is in Santa Monica, a coastal place. The space can place an outdoor sound inside a windowless hallway. It can mix sea with old carpet, childhood with laboratory, store with monster, home with prison. The seagulls can also be read as irony. In another film, the sound of birds might suggest an exit, a coast, air, the outside world. Here, even that sound becomes trapped. The Backrooms can take a symbol of freedom and turn it into an echo. The cardboard man has a different function. It is connected to Async and its experiments. A cardboard cutout is a false human figure, a lifeless presence, a flat imitation. Inside a film obsessed with defective copies of people, that cannot be coincidental. Async uses or places that cardboard figure as part of its tests, possibly to provoke responses, attract entities, or measure behavior. But symbolically, the cardboard duplicates the theme of the still lifes. It is another false humanity, another representation of a person that is not a person. Will there be more Backrooms films? Nothing has been confirmed, but narratively, the door is open, and according to Kane Parsons, his intention has always been for Backrooms to continue beyond a single film. The story can grow in several ways. A direct sequel could follow Mary after the interrogation. Will Async let her go? Will they force her to return? What happens if her copy inside the Backrooms starts to change? What happens if Mary develops a connection with the place because she has already been duplicated? Another possibility is to follow Phil and Async, scientists trying to map the impossible, corporations concealing accidents, expeditions that never return, doors opening in increasingly strange places. It could also work as an anthology. Each film could follow a different person entering through a different access point. That would allow exploration of how the Backrooms distort different kinds of trauma. The key would be to maintain the tension between mystery and explanation. Backrooms can expand, but it should not become a franchise where everything comes with a manual. Its strength lies in the fact that we understand enough to theorize, but not enough to feel comfortable. If there are more films, they should answer some questions and open others that are worse. The ending of Backrooms is not designed to close the mystery, but to reveal its true scale. Clark dies, but his death does not resolve the problem. On the contrary, it reveals how the place works. The Backrooms do not only contain rooms, they contain echoes, copies, remnants, fragments of poorly reconstructed memory. Mary survives, but her survival is tainted. She escapes the monster, but falls into the hands of Async, and while she is being interrogated, another Mary appears inside the labyrinth. That final image is more terrifying than an explicit death because it calls identity into question. What does it mean to leave if a version of you stays behind? What does it mean to survive if the place has already learned to remember you? The Backrooms are not a dream, not a hell, and not simply a metaphor. They are a real anomaly that functions like a broken memory. They absorb the human world and return it incomplete. That is why the sentence that could summarize the film might be this: you can leave the Backrooms, but the Backrooms may never leave you. Because once that place registers you, even imperfectly, something of yours is lost in its hallways forever. Thank you so much for sticking around until this part of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. What did you think of the ending? Do you have any interpretations you'd like to share? Don't hesitate to leave them in the comments. If you like the video, you can support us by giving it a like or subscribing to the channel. See you in the next video!